Welcome back to Building Jam. This week, we're talking about what's happening this week right now on the Capture team. We just went through a massive refactor, a total rework of the whole extension while the wheels are in motion. Imagine 25,000 jams created every day, and while that's happening, we're taking out all the parts, rearranging them, putting them back together without anyone noticing. So Aidan's here from the Capture team, filling us in what's happening this week. When we started the company, Chrome had extensions built on one set of APIs. And recently, they've said, hey, we're updating these APIs, and everyone who's ever built an extension must update their extension, or we're going to start force removing them from the Chrome Web Store. It's one thing to build something from scratch. It is another thing to refactor a bus while it is in motion. Like, people create 25,000 jams a day, and we needed to continue that. But also, every single part of the bus had to come apart and then be pieced back together in a different order. I'm actually really curious to hear what that's like, what it's like to maintain it, the observability building around it. I think that's we're dealing with something that just anyone building a browser extension is dealing with, and but no one else.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I actually joined right at the tail end of that effort. So, two of my colleagues, Hui and Preston, were really driving all of that. I came in and benefited from all of their work and their research into how we had to change some of our concepts between the MV2, the old version of stuff, and MV3, Manifest version 3, the new version of stuff. One of the challenges was that we wanted to roll out the new version of the extension to a subset of users. So you could imagine that we don't want to go and like you're saying, 25,000 gems are being created every day. We don't want to go and interrupt every one of our users with this new extension that is not extensively tested in the wild. And as much as we test it internally, we don't actually know how all of the different ways that the user is going to use it, all of the different sites. The internet is just chaos all around. And we did not know what we didn't know. And so Chrome extension web store has this ability to roll out a new version of the extension to a subset of users. So we tuned it to 10%, let's say. And so fake numbers here, but imagine we had 1,000 users. We roll out to 10% of users. That means 100 users are now on the new version, and 900 users are still on the MV2 version. And that's great. And then we start seeing some bugs. We fix our bugs. We ship some new improvements. And we're ready with a new version. And we want that to go out to 10% of users again. But the problem is that when we release this new version, when we tell it to go out to 10% of users, it grabs 90 of the 900 users still on MV2 and 10 of the users, 10 of the 100 users who are on MV3. And so now we still have 100 users, 10% of our 1,000 users on this newest version. But 90% of the people who were using the version that we're trying to fix bugs on are caught on this bug in this version that we know is buggy and that we have released the fixes for, and we just upgraded a bunch of people into MV3 again that we didn't necessarily intend to or want to. And this is because we had to, like Danny's describing, replace the entire architecture of the extension. There's no way to target with a normal feature release or a feature flag that we might issue. We can't just say hey, this is the same extension code base. Let's move 10% of you into this code path and 90% of you keep on this code path. We literally had to replace the entire guts of the extension that we were uploading to the store. And that was very freaky for us.
It is very freaky, and there are consequences even beyond just engineering. Being in this process made us change our product roadmap, because imagining you're juggling multiple versions of the same product, and now you want to add a feature, you have to add it twice because you still have users who are on the old thing and users who are on multiple versions of the new thing. As you roll out new versions of the new thing, you only roll it out to these little subsets. And so we literally cannot launch a feature because we'd have to build it twice, and we would announce it and say, only 5% of you all get this today. Here's the new feature. And so we had to work on things that were outside of the core capture flow for a while, and only in the bug report itself. So it was an interesting process.
hmm Another thing that was really neat that came out of this is that previously, based on like the old MV2 architecture, Chrome was able to better identify when our extension was idle. And then, as like the way that Chrome extensions work underneath the hood across all of the Chromium browsers is that every about 5 hours, it'll go and check with the web store to see if there's an update available to the extension. And if so, it'll wait for the extension to go idle. And then once it's idle, it'll go and like reload the extension and start it so that the new updates get applied for users. And so this worked perfectly in MV2. But the problem is that the way our extension works in MV3, we actually seem, even in our idle states, we seem to Chromium as if the extension is like still running and still active and still like maintaining a connection with the user, even when we're in a state when it would be perfectly healthy to go and like reload and apply that update. And so after we observed that users were like lingering on old versions of the extension for multiple weeks, and support got into this flow where people would we'd have to go again just because we were new to MV3 and some of the quirks around it. Support was having to go and say like turn the extension on and off again, or like uninstall the extension and reinstall it to get the newest version, and that's not healthy long term. And so we did some exploration to like see why this was happening, discovered Chromium's heuristics that we were kind of seeming overeager with, and then designed our own little activity monitor to go and monitor for the different states that the extension was in that we considered like we definitely did not want to update. And this is like because we do instant replays, we're like capturing events that the user is doing over the course of like 2 minute window across tabs. And so we would go and listen for events like mouse clicks and keyboard presses and tabs, like changing tabs, navigating. And anytime one of those hits, we would go and say, extension is not allowed to update for up to 5 minutes. And after that 5 minutes passes, then we will go and allow the extension to update. And so we kind of have this little loop that's always checking to see if that timer has elapsed. And the other state that we didn't want to be in is even if you're not like actively clicking or typing or something, but you have a draft open, right? Like you've just captured something and maybe you left your computer for a bit because you got a call or it's lunchtime and you stepped away. We still don't want to update the extension because that would end up putting you in a state where you would lose the work that you were creating, and like you just captured this bug, it's in your net, and that now you are just letting it go into the wild if we go and update underneath the hood. So the other state that we do is we watch for when a draft is open and we hold activity. We do not let that timer elapse, and then once we release that hold, then we allow the extension to update again under the hood. And that has, fingers crossed, it has rolled out really recently, and so we're just watching the logs now to make sure that this is behaving super correctly.
Wait,
Mm.
I have a
That's
question
actually
about the instant replays thing, like how it works for the extension to be able to know when it can update. Because like if you technically like whenever you're browsing the web, you could have use of jam, right? If
Mhm.
you come across a bug, then you hit instant replay. So how I didn't really understand like how you would determine if it's like a good time to update it if you don't know really when somebody wants to click instant replay.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The idea here is that the instant replay window is only 2 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And so we, technically speaking, anytime after 2 minutes of activity that like would be caught in an instant replay, then that's a healthy time to update the extension, because then we're not losing any of that data that we have in our instant replays and like the recordings and states that we're storing.
Wait,
But
that's really cool. So it's actually like y'all coded like a way for Google to only update our extension in instant replay intervals.
yes, yeah. When we know that there is nothing interesting in it, like available for instant replays, because you haven't clicked, because you haven't like typed, because you haven't navigated, because you haven't changed tabs, and like a couple of other signals that we use, we just make sure that we like any of these signals that would indicate that you probably have an interesting instant replay available. We don't let the extension update in those cases, so that it doesn't disrupt your ability to instant replay anything. Because if the extension updated in between, right, like
Yeah.
you'd only be able to go back 30 seconds, even though you may want to go back that full 2 minutes.
Very cool.
One thing that's been really cool to watch from afar here is it used to be the case that like support owned uninstall reports. Like support would go through, and then if there were common issues, create a ticket. Um, and there was no point at which someone said, "Hey, this process should change." But one of the results of the engineering team former a tighter capture team just focused on that capture extension flow that's managing the migration to manifest v3 and all the different edge cases and complications that might arise and doing these like very tight rollouts and watching the versions very closely is that they just took on the uninstall reports and started owning them. So every single week, the engineering team, not the support team, now goes through every single uninstall report and looks for logs and is like so proactive about it. And the way that I found this out is not by like being in any team meetings, but I would just like I would see an uninstall report and I'd be like, "Have you seen blank?" And then everyone on the engineering team would be like, "Yes, we already met about this morning." And so for me from afar, I felt like, wow, they like really care about every single user, even if it's one person of the 10,000 people who use Jam today who had this one issue, like they already know and are on it. So that's been like very, very cool for me to see. Aiden, I have a question. One of the tricky things in startups is you have a very, very limited set of resources. Like we're a small team and there's infinite things to do. And there are things that are higher impact and things that are lower impact. And you sort of want to, like focus your time on the right things. And one of the really tough things about Manifest V3 was that we knew for a while this was coming, but for a long time the spec kept changing and the timeline kept changing. And so we are very like conservative about our own resource use as a startup. And so we don't want to work on something that we will have to redo later. So if the spec is still changing, we don't want to spend time on it. And if the timeline is still changing and we're wondering like we want to build the most impactful features before we spend the same amount of resources on refactoring the features that we already have, right? And so we were kind of waiting on when and if we will need to do this. At the same time, so every week, our top 100 users from the week before get an email from me or Urtifa asking like, how are things going? Like, what do you want to see next in Jam? And like every week, one of the top feature requests is Firefox support. Like, when is the Firefox extension coming? But we didn't know but we didn't want to build a Firefox extension if we're gonna do this huge refactor. Like basically, we had sort of uncertainty about timing. And so now that we're on Manifest v3, Aiden, what does it mean for more browser support?
It's same but different. We are going to be able to use like with Manifest v3, because it's service worker based, we are largely going to be able to reuse a lot of the underlying core infrastructure here. The problem is that all of the different browser vendors, like even with Chromium to Firefox, which are quite similar, there are differences in how certain APIs are implemented. And so we need to go and be a little more resilient to that. One of the strategies that we started to introduce in Manifest, like in some of the new code that has been shipping with Manifest v3, is to lean on a technique called dependency injection. And the idea here is that we isolate behavior into different classes. So like I talked before about this like activity monitor that we're using to go and see whether the extension is idle, and if so, then we can go and reload it and apply the updates, right? And so the idea here is that we're using different APIs in the activity monitor to go and like actually hit the install path, right? The way that we tell the browser to go and reinstall or to apply the updated extension or to listen to the store to like hear when there's an update, that's going to be different across all of the different browser vendors. And so instead of going and writing one thing that like we have to go and at build time go and like replace things about it or do runtime code checking to see like if we're in Firefox, then do this. And if we're in Safari, then do this. Like that gets very tiresome and tedious in lots of different places. And one strategy that's going to be really helpful is to, instead of splitting that responsibility out across the entire code base, if we're instead able to go and have a single file that's just like, here's the browser APIs that we use. And so like, here's all of the ways that we call the browser dot whatever, or like, here, when we say we want to go and apply the install, this is what it means. And when we say that we want to go and listen for updates from the web store, this is what that means. And so we can make separate versions of that file for Chrome, for Safari, and for Firefox, and have the build process for the extension take that one file, rename it to like dependencies, and then have the rest of the build kind of flow, because we have the same definition for what these dependencies are across the application. And so when we go and say like new activity monitor, we just pass it a little object that tells it, yeah, these are the dependencies I'm passing in. So like on update available is going to be a function that gets called, and you like, it takes a callback. So give me, when I tell you that I need an on update available function, you go and just give me something that will look like this. And that way we can go and replace the dependencies at build time in a much more consistent way, rather than have engineers go and constantly, as they build out all of these modules, think about like, what are the different code paths that are going to need to run in these different environments. Another really nice benefit of dependency injection is that it makes our tests for this code significantly easier, because we now don't need to go and do this whole rigmarole of like mocking the entirety of like Chrome.runtime APIs, which can be a beast, uh, to go and replace some of that code, and to go and like say, actually, when we say Chrome.runtime, we mean this. Instead, it just means that our tests, whenever they call new activity monitor, can go and pass in a little stub function called on update available. And then we can make sure that on update available gets called with the things that we expect it to be called with. And so our tests are able to run a lot more smoothly and a lot more quickly, reducing the time that things spend in CI, like continuous integration up in like GitHub, where it's telling us whether the changes that we introduced are like breaking anything before it hits Mark, our wonderful QA person.
I will shout out here. As of like 3 hours ago, we are hiring someone to work on testing, quality, support. So if all this sounds interesting to you and you're listening, email Mark, MARC at jam.dev. He's the hiring manager for this. If you like love this tooling and like debugging these like deep browser things, we really want to meet you.
If you want to join the podcast,
Yeah,
one
come
of these
on the
weeks.
podcast. And also support users.
Cool. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.